Hi everyone, back to Frindle today. We're going to jump right in here, but let's remind ourselves that we left Nick posing his ultimate question in order to get rid of homework, which actually backfired in his face. So today we're going to start with Chapter 4, Word Detective. It was a beautiful September afternoon, bright sun, cool breeze, blue sky, but not for Nick. Nick had a little report to do for the next day, plus copy all the definitions for 35 words for Mrs. Granger. This was not the way school is supposed to work, not for Nick. There was a rule at Nick's house: homework first. And that meant right after school. Nick had heard his older brother James groan and grumble about this rule for years, right up until he graduated high school 2 years ago. And then James wrote home from college after his first semester and said, "My grades are looking great because when I came here, I already knew how to put first things first." That letter was the proof Nick's mom and dad had been looking for. Homework first was the law from September to June. Here you go. There's Nick. Don't look too happy, does he? Sitting at his desk there, all his paper, doing his research, and homework first. This had never bothered Nick before because he hardly ever had homework. Sure, he looked over his spelling words on Thursday nights, and there had been a few short book reports in 4th grade. But other than that, nothing. Up to now, schoolwork never spilled over into his free time. Thanks to Miss Granger, those days are gone. First, he looked up the definitions in his brand new red dictionary that his mom had bought because Mrs. Granger told him to. It took almost an hour. He could hear a baseball game in John's yard down the street, yelling and shouting, and every few minutes the sharp crack of a bat connecting with a pitch. But he had a report to do for Mrs. Granger. Nick looked at the very front of his dictionary. There was an introduction to the book called Words and Their Origins. Perfect, Nick thought. It was just what he needed to do his report. It would be all over in a few minutes. Nick could already feel the sun and the breeze on his face as he ran outside to play. Homework all done. And then he read the first sentence from the introduction. I'm going to stop here. I want you to see the sentence. Look at this. From here to here. First sentence. Without question, this modern American dictionary is one of the most surprisingly complex and profound documents ever to be created, for it embodies unparalleled etymological detail, reflecting not only superb lexicographic scholarship, but also the dreams and speech and imaginative talents of millions of people over thousands of years. For every person who has ever spoken or written in English has had a hand in its making. Wow. Long sentence. What? Nick scratched his head and read it again, and then again. Not much better. It was sort of like trying to read the ingredients on a shampoo bottle. He slammed the dictionary shut and walked downstairs. Nick's family did a lot of reading, so bookshelves covered 3 of the 4 walls in his family room. There were 2 sets of encyclopedias. The black set was for grown-ups, and the red set was for kids. Nick pulled out the D volume from the red set and looked up dictionary. There were 3 full pages with headings like early dictionaries, word detectives, and dictionaries today. Not very exciting. But he had to do it, so Nick just plopped down on the couch and read all of it. And when he was finished with the kid's book, he opened up the black encyclopedia and read most of what it said about dictionaries, too. He understood only about half of what he read. He leaned back on the couch and covered his eyes with his arm, trying to imagine himself giving a report on all of this boring stuff. He'd be lucky to have 3 minutes worth. But because Nick was Nick, he suddenly had an idea, and it brought a grin to his face. Nick decided that giving this report could actually be fun. He could make it into something special. After all, Mrs. Granger had asked for it. Ooh, what is Nick doing now? I mean, goodness, right? We're going to move on to Chapter 5 called The Report. Let's see what he does. By lunchtime the next day, Nick had a bad feeling in the pit of his stomach. 7th period was coming. He was going to have to stand up in front of Mrs. Granger's class. The eyes of everyone in the class would be glued to his face, and Mrs. Granger's eyes would be cranked up to maximum punch power. He looked over his notes again and again. The first English dictionary, the growth of the English dictionary, William Shakespeare, words from French and German, new words, old words, new inventions, Anglo-Saxon words, Latin and Greek roots, American English. It all became a big jumble in his mind. And his grand plan from the night before, in the harsh, fluorescent light of the school day, it seemed impossible. What is it with the clocks in this school? When you're planning to go to the carnival after school, the clocks in every class practically run backward and the school day lasts for about 3 weeks. But if you have to go to the barber shop or go shopping for clothes after school, zip, the whole day is over before you can blink. And today, after lunch, periods 5 and 6 went by in 2 ticks. As the 7th period bell rang, Mrs. Granger walked into the classroom, took 4 steps to her desk at the side of the room, flipped open her attendance book, glanced out at the class, and made 2 check marks. Then, looking up at Nick, she said, "I think we have a little report to begin our class today, Nicholas." 15 seconds into 7th period, and Nick was on stage. This lady plays for keeps, thought Nick. He gulped, grabbed his crumbled note cards in his book bag, and walked to the front of the room. He stood next to the giant dictionary on its little table, and Mrs. Granger walked to the back of the classroom and sat primly on a tall stool next to the bookcases. She was wearing her blue uniform. Taking a deep breath, Nick began. "Well, the first thing I learned is that the first English dictionary," Mrs. Granger interrupted. "Excuse me, Nicholas, but does your report have a title?" Nick looked blankly at her. "A title? No, I didn't make a title." "Class, please remember to include a title whenever you prepare an oral or written report. Now please go on, Nicholas." And she smiled and nodded to him. Nick began again. Looking right at Mrs. Granger, he said, "The dictionary." A couple of kids thought it was funny, but Nick played it straight and just kept talking. "A lot of people think that the first English dictionary was put together in the 1700s by a man named Samuel Johnson. He lived in London, England. He was real smart, and he wrote a lot of books, and he wanted all the other smart people to have a good dictionary to use, so he made one. But there were other dictionaries before his. The thing was that different about Johnson's dictionary was its size, first of all. He had over 43,000 words in it. This made the class bunch of noises, big number. Ooh, wow, stuff like that. And Nick lost his concentration. He glanced up at Mrs. Granger, expecting to see those eyes drilling a hole in him, but they weren't. They were almost friendly in a teachery sort of way. She shushed the class and said, "Go on, Nicholas, that's a fine beginning." Nick almost smiled, but he saw all the kids staring at him, so he gripped his note cards even tighter and jumped back in. The other thing that Samuel Johnson did was to choose the words he thought were most important and then give lots of examples showing how the words got used by people. For example, he showed how the word take could be used in 113 different ways. Nick's report went on smoothly for 12 minutes. Nick was surprised at how easy it was to stand and talk about this stuff. At the end of the first 5 minutes, Mrs. Granger had to stop Nick and say again, "Class, it's not good manners to yawn out loud or put your heads down on your desks when someone is giving an oral report." No one in the class cared one little bit about the report, except Mrs. Granger. Every time Nick glanced up, she was smiling. And her eyes were not the least bit icy or sharp. She was eating the stuff up, listening and nodding, and every once in a while she would say, "Very good point," or "Yes, that's exactly right." Excuse me. But the next time Nick looked up, he saw Mrs. Granger sneaking a look at her watch. Maybe this idea was going to work after all. Time for phase 2. Reaching into his book bag, Nick pulled out the red dictionary he brought from home, the one most kids had, the one Mrs. Granger said they should use. Nick said, "This is the dictionary that I use at home for my vocabulary work, and I opened it to the last night to the very front, and there, right, was where I found out a lot about how the dictionary was made, right in this book. So I thought some of the ideas would be a good part of my project. It says here," Nicholas, Nick looked up. Mrs. Granger got off her tall stool, and its wooden legs made a screech on the linoleum. Heads snapped to attention, and the class was alert again. Mrs. Granger smiled, raised her eyebrows, and pointed at her watch. Nicholas, I think the class should read this at home themselves. Now, John's hand shot up in the air, and Mrs. Granger's nod said, But I don't have that dictionary at home, Mrs. Granger. I have the blue one. And several other kids immediately said, Oh, me too, me too. Mrs. Granger tried not to show that she was annoyed. Very well, Nick, but it shouldn't take too long. We have other things to do today. Nick kept his eyes wide open and nodded, adjusted his glasses on his nose, and began to read. Without question, this modern American dictionary is one of the most surprisingly complex and profound documents ever to be created, for it embodies unparalleled etymological detail, reflecting not only superb lexicographic scholarship, but also the dreams and speech and imaginative talents of millions of people over thousands of years. For every person who has ever spoken or written in English has had a hand in its writing. He just read that very long sentence. He continued on. It was a long article, and the kids were bored to death. No one looked bored at all. Every kid in the room knew exactly how long that period, or knew exactly that period was more than half over, and that Nick's report wasn't a report. It was one of the greatest time wasters he had ever invented. Mrs. Granger knew it too. She had edged around from the back of the room to the side near the windows. Nick glanced up at her now and then as he read, and each time Mrs. Granger's eyes clicked up a new power level. After 8 minutes of Nick's best non-stop reading, her eyes were practically burning holes in the chalkboard behind him. There were only 10 minutes left in 7th period. When he took a breath to start the new paragraph, Mrs. Granger cut him off. That's a fine place to start, but Nicholas, class, let's all give him a round of applause for his report. The applause didn't last long. As Nick took his book bag and notes and sat down, Mrs. Granger's eyes went back to almost normal, and she actually smiled at him. Although your report was a little long, she paused to let that sink in. It was quite a good one. And isn't it fascinating that English has more different words than any other language anywhere in this world? She pointed at her large dictionary. That one book contains the definitions of more than 450,000 words. Now, wasn't I right, Nicholas? All this will mean so much more since you learned about it on your own. Mrs. Granger was beaming at him. Nick sank lower in his chair. This was worse than writing the report, worse than standing up and to give it. He was being treated like the teacher's pet. And he had the feeling she was doing it on purpose. His reputation was in great danger, so he launched another question. He raised his hand, and he didn't even wait for Mrs. Granger to call on him. Yeah, but, I still don't really get the idea of why words all mean different things. Like, who says that D-O-G means the thing that goes woof and wags its tail? Who says so? Mrs. Granger took the bait. Who says dog means dog? You do, Nicholas. You and me and everyone in this class, in this school, in this town, in this state, in this country. We all agree. If we lived in France, we would all agree that the right word for the hairy four-legged creature was a different word. It sounds like chien, but it means what D-O-G means to you and me. And in Germany, they all say Hund, and so on, all around the globe. But if all of us in this room decided to call that creature something else, and if everyone else did too, then that's what it would be called. And one day it would be written in the dictionary that way. We decide what goes in that book. And she pointed to the giant dictionary, and she looked right at Nick, and she smiled again. And then Miss Granger went on. But of course, that dictionary was worked on by hundreds of very smart people for many years. So as far as we are all concerned, that dictionary is the law. Laws can change, of course, but only if they need to. There may be new words that need to be made, but the ones in that book have been put there for good reasons. Mrs. Granger took a look at the clock. 8 minutes left. Now then, for today, Now then, for today, you were to have done the exercises beginning on page 12 in your Words Alive book. Please get out your papers. Sarah, will you read the first sentence, identify the mistake, and then tell us how you corrected it? Mrs. Granger jammed the whole day's work into last 8 minutes. A blur of verbs and nouns and prepositions, and yes, there was another homework assignment. And Nick didn't try to sidetrack Mrs. G again. He had slowed her down a little, but had he stopped her? No way. She was unstoppable, at least for today. And we're going to stop right there. What do you think? Do you think Nick had a good plan there? Do you think it worked? Or is this going to be a continued battle? What do you think? Let me know. I'll talk to you soon.